The office was sterile in a way that made Jessa Thorne feel like she was being sanitized just by sitting in the chair. The air smelled faintly of citrus disinfectant, and everything, from the polished glass table to the smooth, windowless walls, seemed designed to keep you from leaving fingerprints. The woman sitting across from her wore a navy suit so sharp it looked like it could slice paper, and her tone was as cool as the untouched bottle of water she'd placed between them. "The terms are non-negotiable," the woman said, tapping one perfectly manicured nail against the printed document. "You've already reviewed the contract with your liaison at the agency, correct?" Jessa nodded, though her stomach had been in knots for the past 24 hours. She'd read the contract 6 times, sitting at her mother's bedside in the hospital, her eyes blurring at the clauses and conditions while machines beeped softly in the background. A surrogacy agreement. 1 pregnancy, 2 babies. A one-time payout that could cover her mother's surgery, pay off Jessa's nursing school loans, and maybe even let them move into a decent apartment. The money was impossible to ignore. $750,000, half up front, the rest upon completion and surrender of parental rights. In exchange, full compliance with health protocols, mandatory screenings, no travel without permission, no drugs, no alcohol, no romantic entanglements, and most of all, no legal claim to the children after delivery. The contract was absolute, cold, and binding. Jessa cleared her throat, feeling the knot in her chest tighten. "Yes, I've read it." The woman didn't smile. "Then all that's left is your signature." The pen was black metal and unnaturally heavy, like it knew the weight of what she was about to do. Jessa's hand hovered above the line. The room was too quiet. She could still hear her mother's voice from the night before, too weak to sit up but lucid enough to beg her not to worry. "I'll get better, Jess," she'd whispered. "You don't have to do anything crazy." But her mother's insurance had capped out 2 weeks ago. The chemo wasn't working. The new treatment wasn't covered. The GoFundMe campaign had stalled at $12,000. And Jessa was already working 2 night shifts a week at the ER on top of her day job at the pediatric clinic. She was 29, exhausted, and stuck in a system that never forgave poor choices or late payments. She signed. The woman clicked the binder closed and stood, smoothing her jacket without even looking at the page. "Congratulations. You'll be contacted within the next 48 hours to begin preliminary testing and prep. Your medical expenses, living stipend, and transportation will be covered in full for the duration of the contract. You'll receive your first payment after your second confirmed appointment." Jessa stood slowly, the reality of it sinking in like cold water down her spine. "Can I know who the parents are?" The woman paused only for a second, her face unreadable. "The contract guarantees their anonymity. But I can tell you this. Your clients are extremely private, extremely wealthy, and extremely invested in the outcome of this arrangement. I suggest you focus on your part." She didn't say goodbye. Jessa stepped into the elevator with a hollow feeling in her gut, the black folder pressed to her chest. She didn't cry. She had no time to cry. She just walked out of the gleaming glass building into the buzzing city, where people passed her by without knowing she'd just agreed to give away the only thing she'd ever create that would carry her DNA. Later that night, back at her apartment, a cramped 1 bedroom with a leaky faucet and paint peeling above the shower, she lay awake listening to the neighbor's TV bleed through the wall. She turned the contract over and over in her hands, reading the clauses again. Page 17, Clause 9A. In the event of medical complications, the contractor agrees to relinquish any personal decision-making to the intended guardians. Page 21, Clause 11B. Upon successful delivery, the contractor will vacate any role, temporary or permanent, in the life of the offspring. There was no name, just the initials CW. She signed away her motherhood to a monogram. Jessa closed her eyes and thought about the future she was about to create, only to never be part of it. She told herself it didn't matter, that she was saving a life, her mother's, that she was choosing responsibility over emotion. That biology didn't equal destiny. But deep down, a voice whispered, "You're giving away something that will call someone else mama." And it was a thought she couldn't drown, even as she pressed her face into the pillow and pretended she could still sleep like she used to, before she sold her future to a stranger. Jessa's body changed faster than she expected. By the 12th week, her stomach had begun to round, and her breasts ached in the mornings before her feet even hit the floor. The nausea, the fatigue, the bizarre food aversions, they all hit her like a wave that wouldn't break. But she endured it with quiet discipline, tracking every symptom in the app provided by the private clinic the agency had assigned her to. Every week, she had check-ins, blood draws, psychological screenings, and dietary reviews. She followed every rule meticulously, not out of fear of consequence, but out of some strange, growing sense of obligation, not to the clients, but to the two lives forming inside her. The clinic was pristine and discreet, located in the Upper East Side behind a nondescript facade that gave no indication of what happened inside. No reception area, no waiting room with baby magazines. Everything was appointment only, private elevators, private entrances, and carefully scheduled sessions so that no two patients ever saw each other. It was clinical to the point of discomfort, and Jessa often wondered how many other women had passed through these halls under similar contracts. Nameless, faceless surrogates for the anonymous elite. At 19 weeks, she was scheduled for her first full anatomy scan. She laid back on the plush examination table, a soft blanket draped over her legs as the technician applied warm gel to her belly. A large screen came to life above them, and in grainy gray and white, the twins appeared. They were moving, kicking, twisting, one with a hand to its face, the other curled in a tight ball near her rib cage. It took Jessa's breath away. "They look good," the technician said absently, typing something into her monitor. "Heart rates are strong. No abnormalities noted." Jessa nodded, swallowing the sudden emotion tightening her throat. She blinked quickly, focusing on the screen. Her fingers gripped the edge of the table harder than necessary. "Can I know their genders?" she asked, unsure whether it was allowed. The technician hesitated, then shrugged. "You're the one carrying them." "Sure. One boy, one girl." She knew it didn't mean anything. Not legally, not contractually. But something clicked in her chest at the words. A boy and a girl. Eli and Lena. Names she'd dreamed of once when she was 19 and believed the future would be kinder. She didn't say the names aloud. She just etched them into the back of her mind and pressed her lips together until the pressure stopped the tears from forming. That evening, while riding the bus back to Queens, Jessa scrolled through her phone looking for articles on prenatal nutrition, twin development, and tips for sleeping with back pain. She clicked on a medical journal link without thinking, not recognizing the publication until she reached the byline. Sponsored by Aon Pharmaceuticals, C. Ward Foundation for Pediatric Research. The initials hit her like a punch. She sat still for a moment, staring at the screen. Then she searched the name. Cassian Ward. It brought up pages of results. Forbes profiles, business articles, opinion pieces, scandal rumors. CEO of Aon. Net worth $6.3 billion. Unmarried. No children. Philanthropist, innovator, known for aggressive corporate takeovers and a famously controlled public persona. Every photo showed a tall, austere man in tailored suits, never smiling. The kind of man who looked like he had never heard a baby cry in his life. Then she saw the obituary. Vivian Elise Ward, 34, passed away due to complications from a hemorrhagic stroke after a failed IVF attempt. Survived by her brother Cassian Ward. No surviving spouse or children. In lieu of flowers, donations were requested to the Neonatal Research Fund under the C. Ward Foundation. Jessa blinked at the screen, the realization creeping in like frost. Vivian, his sister. She reread the article, and her pulse began to race. The timing lined up. The contract had been signed just over a month after Vivian's death. Jessa had been chosen because she was healthy, single, without a criminal record, and, according to the agency, emotionally unattached. What no one had told her was that the woman who had commissioned the surrogacy was already gone by the time the rare embryos were transferred. Her jaw clenched. Her mind began filling in the blanks with a chilling kind of logic. Cassian hadn't wanted a surrogate to create a family. He'd wanted to preserve one. This wasn't about creating life. It was about controlling it, about legacy, about grief. She thought of the way the lawyer never said parents, only clients. She remembered how the contract emphasized complete severance post-birth. No photos, no names, just signatures and silence. Jessa couldn't sleep that night. She lay awake in the dim light of her apartment, staring at the ceiling, her hand over her belly. The babies kicked, soft flutters that felt like the brush of butterfly wings. It was the first time they'd moved so strongly. It should have filled her with wonder, with warmth. Instead, she felt sick. She realized that she wasn't just carrying someone else's children. She was carrying a dead woman's dream, being raised by a man who hadn't wanted them in the first place, but who had enough money and power to make sure they existed anyway. And once they were born, she would disappear. She tried to tell herself it didn't matter, that she had agreed, that she had signed, that she knew what she was doing, but it did matter, because they were moving, because they were real, because they were hers, if only for these fleeting months when no one else could feel them, feed them, love them like she did. She got up, padded barefoot to the small kitchen, and poured herself a glass of water with shaking hands. For the first time since signing that contract, she felt something more dangerous than regret. She felt doubt. By the time Jessa reached her 34th week, the strain on her body was relentless. Carrying twins meant discomfort that grew exponentially by the day. Her hips ached constantly, her back protested every time she stood, and sleep came only in short, shallow waves. But she endured it, quietly, methodically. She attended every appointment, took every prescribed supplement, avoided the foods on the agency's forbidden list, even when all she wanted was a greasy slice of pizza from the corner shop. She moved through each day like a soldier fulfilling her duty, even as a quiet storm built beneath her composure. The clinic visits became more frequent as her due date approached. She noticed subtle changes in the staff. The way the nurses offered polite but clipped smiles, the way the obstetrician refused to answer certain questions, the way the psychologist's notes were always just out of her reach. She began to feel like a prisoner being monitored rather than a patient being cared for. At one of her final appointments, she was ushered into a private room where an unfamiliar man in a dark gray suit waited behind a polished desk. He stood when she entered and extended his hand, introducing himself as Mr. Hanley, an attorney representing the interests of the client family. He said the words in a monotone voice, as if he'd said them 1,000 times before and never truly thought about what they meant. "We're nearing the final stage of the agreement," he said, sliding a fresh document across the desk toward her. "This is a reaffirmation of your legal release, standard practice. Just formalizing that you forfeit any and all parental rights after birth." Jessa stared at the paper. Her name was at the top, her signature already pre-filled digitally in one section. Beneath it were lines of dense legal language that made her stomach turn. "Why now?" she asked, her voice quiet but steady. "As I said, standard practice. With high-profile contracts, we like to ensure nothing becomes problematic post-delivery." Her gaze flicked up. "Problematic how?" He paused for just a breath too long. "Just a precaution. Mr. Ward is a very private individual." There it was, the name spoken aloud for the first time in her presence. Cassian Ward. Jessa didn't reply. She didn't touch the document. She simply stood, nodded tightly, and walked out. She didn't return home that night. Instead, she took the subway down to the Upper West Side and stood for nearly 30 minutes outside a massive glass tower that reached into the sky like it was trying to puncture the clouds. The Ward Tower, Aeon Pharmaceuticals' global headquarters. A 24-hour guard stood near the entrance, indifferent to her presence, used to people lingering with curiosity or protest signs. Jessa didn't have either, just questions that burned in her chest and refused to cool. The next day, labor came early. She was alone in her apartment when the first contraction hit, sharp and low and unmistakably real. At first, she thought it was just Braxton Hicks again, but by the time her knees buckled on the way to the bathroom, she knew. The car sent by the agency arrived within 20 minutes of her call. She was rushed not to a regular hospital but to the same private clinic, this time through the underground entrance she hadn't used before. The staff moved around her like clockwork, efficient, emotionless, rehearsed. She was wheeled into a sterile delivery room with chrome surfaces and soundproofed walls. 2 nurses, a doctor, and a midwife she had never seen before surrounded her. She asked for someone to hold her hand. No one did. When the pain crescendoed, she screamed. No one spoke her name. When the first baby came, Eli, they took him before she could see his face. The second, Lena, was born minutes later. She didn't cry at first. Jessa panicked. tried to sit up but was restrained gently by a nurse's firm hands. Then the cry came, thin, delicate, alive. Jessa wept. They didn't let her hold them. They didn't even bring them near her. Instead, someone whispered something into a wireless earpiece and nodded toward the door. A moment later, the room shifted. Everyone stood straighter. The doctor stepped back. The nurses lowered their eyes, and he walked in. Cassian Ward. He was taller than the photographs suggested, broader in the shoulders, and dressed in a dark suit with a long wool coat, still dripping with melted snow. His hair was perfectly combed, his expression impassive, almost detached. But his eyes, gray, stormy, and searching, landed on the two swaddled forms, and something in his face cracked. Just slightly, barely noticeable, but Jessa saw it. He walked past her without speaking, past the bed where she lay, bleeding and broken and still trembling. He stopped in front of the incubators where the twins had been placed. He looked at them like he wasn't sure if they were real. Then he reached down and, awkwardly, carefully, placed a hand on Lena's tiny chest. His voice, when he spoke, was quiet but filled the room. "They're breathing." The doctor cleared his throat and began listing statistics. Weights, APGAR scores, vitals. But Cassian didn't seem to hear any of it. His gaze stayed fixed on the twins, as if afraid they might disappear. Then he turned and looked at Jessa. For a long moment, neither of them said anything. She was still half numb, covered in sweat, tears streaking down her face, her hair plastered to her temples. Her hands were empty. Her heart was too. Cassian's eyes didn't flinch, but they weren't cruel, just guarded. "I didn't think you'd want to see me," he said quietly. "I didn't think you'd come," she replied, her voice hoarse. He studied her, his expression unreadable. "They're strong." "They were mine first," she whispered, the truth falling out of her like glass. Something flickered behind his gaze then. Anger, guilt, confusion. But it vanished as quickly as it came. "You signed the contract," he said. "So did you." He turned away then, walking back toward the babies. The nurse leaned in to ask if he wanted to hold one of them. He hesitated, then nodded. They placed Eli into his arms, and for a moment, Jessa saw something terrifying and beautiful. He didn't look like a man holding a stranger's child. He looked like a man holding a second chance. Jessa closed her eyes. When she opened them again, they were gone. The room was empty. Her body felt hollow, her soul even more so. And in the silence that followed, she knew the truth. She had delivered her children into the arms of a man who didn't know how to love, but had more power than anyone should ever have to learn. The days that followed blurred into one another, a haze of aching muscles, silent rooms, and that terrible, crushing emptiness where two heartbeats used to live inside her. Jessa had never known that grief could be so physical. She'd expected the sadness. She'd expected the guilt. But she hadn't anticipated the way her body would mourn independently of her will. How her arms would ache, as if still expecting the weight of newborns. How her milk would come in with no mouths to feed. How she'd wake in the middle of the night with a start, sure she had heard crying, only to remember she was alone. She stayed in the hospital for another 24 hours. Not because she wanted to, but because they made her. She wasn't treated as a patient anymore, more like an empty vessel waiting to be discharged. No one asked how she was feeling beyond the obligatory chart updates. No one used the words congratulations or mother. She was a footnote in the process, a completed phase. A nurse she hadn't seen before entered her room just before discharge. She was older, maybe mid-50s, with kind eyes and a badge clipped to her scrubs that simply said, Maureen. She didn't rush, didn't check her watch. She sat at the edge of the bed and offered Jessa a small cup of ice water and a granola bar. "You did something very hard," Maureen said softly. Jessa stared at her for a moment. "I did something very stupid." Maureen shook her head. "No, you made a choice. And choices always come with cost." Tears welled in Jessa's eyes, but she didn't let them fall. She couldn't afford to cry anymore. Crying wouldn't change the fact that two lives had exited her body and been placed into someone else's arms before she ever had the chance to memorize their faces. After signing a few final documents, discharge instructions, liability waivers, confidentiality reinforcement, Jessa stepped into the cold January air and walked away from the clinic. There was no car waiting, no driver, no follow-up call. Her account had already been credited with the final balance, and the agency contact had gone silent. She was no longer part of anything. She went home to her apartment, climbed into bed fully clothed, and didn't move for almost 24 hours. It wasn't until 3 days later, when her breasts were painfully engorged and her head pounded from dehydration, that she forced herself into the shower and scrubbed her skin raw, as if she could wash away the feeling of having been, what? Used. Complicit? Absent? Her mother called that afternoon. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice weak but sharper than it had been in months. Jessa lied. "Yeah, I'm okay. You sound tired." "It's just work," Jessa said, her eyes fixed on the cracks in her ceiling. "How are you feeling?" "They said the scans look better. They want to keep me on the new protocol another 6 weeks." "That's good." "It is," her mother agreed, but then paused. "You did something for me. I don't know what it was, but I can feel it. I just want you to know I'm grateful. But you don't owe me anything, Jessa. You never did." After they hung up, Jessa curled up on the couch and stared at the ceiling until the sun dipped below the skyline. She kept waiting for something inside her to settle. It didn't. A week passed, then another. She returned to her shifts at the ER, where no one asked about the sudden weight loss or the hollowness behind her eyes. Nurses were expected to push through. She worked 12-hour days, returned home, and collapsed into silence. Then one night, while waiting for the subway home, she saw them. It was a photo, blown up on a digital billboard above a high-end department store. Cassian Ward makes rare appearance with newborn twins. The image was striking. Cassian stepping out of a sleek black car, holding a carrier in each hand. His expression was unreadable, but both babies were asleep, bundled in thick cashmere wraps. The crowd around him blurred as the camera focused in on the man who never made public appearances, especially not with children. Jessa stared until the screen changed. She tried to walk away, tried to convince herself that it didn't matter, that they were safe, that she'd made her decision. But when she got home, her body moved faster than her mind. She sat at her laptop and began searching. Photos, news clippings, interviews. She learned more about Cassian Ward in 1 hour than she ever had before. His company, his foundation, his reputation. She found out he lived in a penthouse on the edge of Central Park, in a building with biometric locks and private security. And she found something else. A forum post from a nannying agency, anonymous, unverified, but it mentioned that Ward was interviewing private childcare professionals for 2 infants, recently adopted. Extremely high profile, discreet only. Jessa stared at the post until the screen blurred. The babies hadn't been adopted. They had been born. She closed the laptop. For the next 5 days, she didn't let herself think. She went to work, cleaned obsessively, cooked food she didn't eat, but her dreams betrayed her, filled with phantom cries, tiny fists, the smell of newborn skin. Finally, on a Sunday morning, she dressed in her cleanest jeans and a winter coat with a zipper that barely worked. She got on a train and rode uptown. When she arrived at the towering glass building that housed Cassian Ward's penthouse, she hesitated only once before walking through the revolving door. A man at the security desk looked up, surprised. "Can I help you?" Jessa's voice barely rose above a whisper. "I need to see Cassian Ward." The man frowned. "Do you have an appointment?" "No." "Are you press?" "No." "Then I'm afraid I'm the surrogate," she said, more loudly this time. The words hung in the air, heavy and impossible to take back. The man blinked, unsure what to do. He picked up a phone, spoke into it briefly, and then gestured toward a waiting area with expensive leather chairs and art Jessa didn't recognize. "Wait here," he said. "Someone will come down." She sat. Her hands trembled. Her legs bounced. She told herself to get up and leave, to forget this, but she stayed. 17 minutes later, the elevator opened, and there he was. Cassian Ward in dark slacks and a black sweater, with the same quiet intensity he wore in every photo. He stepped into the lobby like a man stepping onto a battlefield, calm, controlled, dangerous. He didn't smile. He didn't offer his hand. He looked her over slowly, eyes narrowing. Then he said, "You shouldn't be here." Jessa stood, chest tight. "I know. Why are you?" She hesitated, then met his gaze. "Because I delivered them into this world. And I just want to know if they're okay." Cassian studied her for a long moment. Then finally he said, "Come upstairs." And just like that, the story she thought had ended began all over again. The elevator ride to the top floor was silent, and it stretched longer than it should have. Not because of the height, but because of the weight between them. Jessa stood near the back, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. Cassian was beside the control panel, arms crossed, staring straight ahead, with a face carved out of stone. No one said a word, not when the floors blinked by, not when the elevator let out the soft, mechanical chime that meant they'd arrived. When the doors opened, Jessa hesitated before stepping out. She didn't know what she expected. Glass walls and gleaming floors, maybe. Some stark, colorless space that matched the image of him she'd built in her head. But the penthouse wasn't cold. It was quiet, yes, and impeccably curated. But it held warmth in small ways. Sunlight flooding through wide windows, thick rugs muffling footsteps, a few framed photos on the shelves that weren't posed or polished. She noticed a knit blanket folded across the back of the couch, a well-worn teddy bear sitting beside a bottle on the coffee table, and somewhere in the distance a baby's soft cry. She turned to look at him, but he was already walking toward the sound, and she followed without being told. They moved through a short hallway that opened into a nursery, and for the first time since that sterile delivery room, Jessa saw her children, not from across a room, not swaddled and whisked away by nurses, but here in the dim light of a late morning, in a room painted soft gray, with stars on the ceiling and two cribs by the window. Lena was fussing in one crib, her tiny fist curled at her cheeks. Ely was asleep in the other, mouth slightly open, chest rising in even rhythms. Jessa stopped in the doorway, frozen. Cassian walked over to Lena, gently lifted her into his arms, and held her against his shoulder like it was second nature. She quieted almost immediately, and he bounced slightly, a rhythm she recognized. He wasn't clumsy. He wasn't cold. He didn't look like a man doing this out of duty. He looked like a man who hadn't known how to love until he had no choice but to learn. "She has reflux," he said quietly, not looking at Jessa. "At night mostly. Eli sleeps longer, but startles easily. They both like white noise." Jessa's mouth opened, but no words came. "Do you want to hold her?" he asked, still not turning. Her knees nearly gave out at the question. She stepped forward slowly, like approaching something sacred. He turned and passed Lena to her with careful hands, and the moment the baby's weight settled into Jessa's arms, she felt a sound rise in her throat she hadn't expected. It was laughter, low and trembling, breaking into a sob before she could stop it. Lena blinked up at her with those familiar, dark blue eyes, and something in Jessa shattered. The walls she'd built to survive the aftermath, the silence, the distance, they all collapsed under the simple fact of this child's heartbeat against her chest. Cassian stood nearby, silent but not unmoved. He watched her with the same intensity he had that day in the hospital, but this time, something else flickered beneath it. Not suspicion, not pride. Something more fragile. Curiosity, maybe, or uncertainty. "I never held her," Jessa whispered, rocking gently, her voice barely audible. "They took her before I could even see her face." "She was breathing slow," he said after a pause. "They said it was precautionary." Jessa nodded, though it didn't matter now. The moment was already here, living and breathing in her arms. She sat in the rocking chair near the window, cradling Lena, memorizing the shape of her fingers, the curl of her lip. Time bent in that room. For a while she forgot Cassian was even there. But then he spoke. "You could have come for money. You didn't." She looked up, startled. "That's not why I'm here." "I know," he said simply. "That's why I let you in." She glanced back down at Lena, who had started to doze. "Why did you take them? After your sister died, why didn't you cancel the contract?" He was quiet for a long time. When he finally answered, he didn't look at her. "I didn't know what else to do. Vivian, she wanted them so badly. It was the only thing she wanted that she couldn't build for herself. And when she was gone, there was no one left who cared enough to carry her wishes through. So I did it. I followed through. At first I told myself it was for her. Then I thought maybe it was for the sake of legacy. But now, I don't know. I just know that I don't want them raised by strangers." She let the words settle before saying anything. "I'm not a stranger." He looked at her then, sharply. "No, you're not. But you were supposed to be. It was the first time he let his guard slip. And for just a moment, Jessa saw him. Not the CEO, not the calculated executor of contracts, but the man underneath all that armor. The man who had stood alone in a delivery room, making choices he hadn't prepared for. She didn't push him. She simply said, "I'd like to come back. Not forever, not to make anything messy, but just to know them. Even if it's from a distance." He crossed his arms, leaned against the edge of the dresser. "They already know you. They just don't know what you are." "I don't know what I am either," she admitted. "Not their mother. Not really. But I still feel them inside me, like a phantom limb." Another long silence stretched between them, but this one didn't feel sharp or tense. It felt suspended, like a breath waiting to be exhaled. Finally, he said, "I need help. I've been pretending I can do this on my own, but I can't. I don't know what I'm doing, not really." She looked at him stunned. "I have 2 night nannies, 3 pediatricians on call, a nutritionist, but none of them know how to soothe Eli when he gets that faraway look in his eyes, or how Lena won't eat unless someone's holding her close. You knew those things, without being told." She swallowed hard. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying, maybe we rewrite the contract." He didn't smile. He didn't ask for forgiveness. But in those words, something inside her flickered, like a light finally finding its switch. She didn't trust him, not completely, not yet, but she wanted to. And for the first time since that delivery room, she allowed herself to imagine what that might mean. Jessa moved in on a Tuesday. It wasn't planned. There was no grand decision, no moment of clarity where everything shifted with one breath. It happened because Lena had a fever and the night nanny had called out. Cassian texted her at 10:42 p.m., something he had never done before. And when she saw the message, she didn't hesitate. She arrived just after midnight, hair tied back, bag slung over one shoulder, and eyes focused on the baby girl who now cried, with a rasp in her throat and heat in her cheeks. She stayed through the night, then the next one, then the weekend. After that, Cassian asked her if she'd consider staying longer. No contracts, no pressure, just to help keep things steady. She agreed with the same quiet resolve that had carried her through pregnancy. Not for him, but for them. For the twins who'd started to recognize her face, who responded to her voice in ways that no hired professional ever earned. The apartment adapted to her presence faster than either of them expected. Her coat found its place on the hook beside his. Her mug, a chipped ceramic one with painted lemons, sat in the cabinet among his glassware. She started keeping her tea in the third drawer of the kitchen, the one he never used. Soon there was a pair of slippers under the bench in the foyer, a book left open on the armrest of the couch, a lullaby half-hummed in the hallway at night. Cassian didn't question any of it. He was too busy trying to figure out how a house could feel more like a home just because someone else started breathing in it. At first, their routines didn't overlap much. Cassian left early, returned late, and spent long hours in his home office between. He worked like a man chasing redemption through achievement, endless meetings, strategic planning, global partnerships. But something began to shift. He started ending calls earlier. He began checking in during dinner. He paused in doorways more often, just watching. Jessa curled on the floor with Lena, stacking blocks while Eli tried to chew on her shirt. He never interrupted, but his presence began to linger. And then one evening, he stayed. They were in the nursery, all 3 of them, when it happened. Jessa had just finished feeding Lena, while Eli lay on a blanket beside them, gurgling contentedly. She was humming a tune from her childhood, something soft and wordless, when Cassian stepped inside, unusually quiet. He didn't speak right away. He just stood there, hands in his pockets, watching. "Something wrong?" she asked, her voice low. He shook his head. "No, I just didn't want to work tonight." She smiled, faint but real. "Good." He crossed the room and sat beside her, his suit still on, tie loosened, sleeves rolled to the elbow. They sat in silence for a long moment, both of them listening to the subtle sounds of breathing, cooing, and the occasional hiccup. Then he leaned back against the wall and closed his eyes. "When Vivian died," he said suddenly, voice rough, "I thought I'd stop feeling anything. I told myself grief was just noise, that I could outwork it, outperform it, overpower it." Jessa didn't respond. She waited. But it doesn't go anywhere, he continued. It just waits beneath the surface. And when you least expect it, it takes your legs out. She looked at him then, not with pity, but with understanding. I know, she whispered. Grief is love that didn't get to finish. Cassian's eyes opened. He turned his head toward her, something raw flickering behind his composed mask. I think I failed them, he said, before they were even born. Jessa shook her head. You didn't fail. You just didn't know. None of us did. He looked down at Eli, now dozing on the blanket, his tiny chest rising and falling. You said once you didn't know what you were, he murmured. Not a mother, not really. Do you still feel that way? She thought about it. The question settled deep inside her, somewhere between her ribs and heart. I feel like I'm something, she said finally. Something real. Maybe not what I expected, but something that matters when he nodded slowly as if accepting that truth like a confession. The next day, everything changed. It started with a knock on the door. Not security, not delivery. A man in a sharp gray coat with an envelope in his hand and a neutral expression on his face. When Cassian opened the door, the man simply said, You've been served. It was a formal complaint, filed by an anonymous party. Allegations of unlawful surrogacy, violations of parental rights, possible child trafficking through legal loopholes. It named both him and Jessa directly. The world didn't explode, not at first, but the tremors began. Cassian's legal team convened an emergency meeting. Statements were drafted. PR advisors urged silence. It'll pass, they said. You're not the first billionaire to be accused of manipulating the system. It's noise. But this wasn't just noise. It was truth laced with half-lies, details someone could only know from the inside, someone who had seen the contract, someone who had reason to want revenge, the agency. Jessa sat in the kitchen holding the letter, her hands trembling. They're going to take them from us. Cassian stood across the table, pale and cold. No, they're not. She looked up at him, tears in her eyes. We gave them every reason to. His jaw clenched. Then we take it back. We give them the truth. The truth won't matter. You think people care about the law when the word trafficking is in the headline? You think they'll care that I carried them because I had no other choice? They'll care, he said, if I make them care. Jessa stood, crossing to him. Cassian, if we fight this, they'll put us under a microscope. They'll dig into everything. My past, my family, your business. They'll make us bleed. I'll bleed, he said, voice steel. Not you. She shook her head. It doesn't work like that. His voice dropped. Then what do we do? She swallowed, her chest aching. We protect them, even if that means letting go. He stared at her, the air between them suddenly fragile. Are you saying we give them up? I'm saying, she whispered, we need to be willing to, if it means keeping them out of a courtroom. He looked at her for a long time, and for the first time since she'd met him, Cassian Ward didn't have an answer. The news broke 3 days later. It started with a single headline, tucked into the sidebar of a lesser-known business blog. Anonymous complaint filed against Aon CEO. Surrogacy deal under investigation. Within hours, it metastasized across social media, digital tabloids, and cable news. Screens flashed with bold-lettered phrases like illicit contract, surrogate mother speaks out, an ethical gray zone in billionaire birth scandal. The story had everything the public craved: wealth, secrecy, power imbalance, and, at the center of it all, 2 innocent babies born into a war over who had the right to love them. Cassian watched it unfold from the living room, the TV muted, his phone buzzing nonstop with messages he didn't answer. He hadn't slept more than a handful of hours in the last few nights. His legal team had filed emergency motions to seal the complaint, but it was too late. The court document had already been leaked, and the vultures had circled. Jessa sat on the other end of the couch, holding Lena close, the baby's forehead pressed against her collarbone, and her fingers clutched at Jessa's sweater like she could sense something wrong in the air. Eli lay in his bassinet nearby, stirring with soft, restless noises. Jessa turned to look at him. Her voice was quiet but cutting. You knew this could happen, didn't you? Cassian nodded slowly. I thought we could contain it. I underestimated how quickly it would spread. She didn't say you always do. But the silence between them spoke it loudly. "They're saying I was coerced," she said bitterly, "that you targeted me, that I was a desperate woman with no options." His eyes flicked toward her, sharp. "They're painting you as a victim because they can't fathom a woman choosing this." "They're not entirely wrong," she said, her voice taut. "I was desperate, but I still chose. I signed that contract. I knew what I was giving up. What I didn't know was who I was giving them to." That landed like a stone between them. He didn't defend himself. Instead, he stood, moved to the window, and stared out over Central Park, where reporters had already begun to gather. Their cameras flashed like lightning against the morning fog. Drones buzzed in the distance. His sanctuary, the fortress he had built to keep the world out, was now nothing more than a glass box under scrutiny. "Do you regret it?" he asked finally, without turning. "Giving them to me?" Jessa took a long breath. "No. I regret not knowing you better before I did." He turned slowly, leaning against the window frame. "Then let's change that." She narrowed her eyes. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying we stop hiding," he replied. "We stop letting other people tell our story for us. You and I, we didn't do this perfectly. But no one else raised those kids for the past 6 months. No one else stayed up all night with Lena when she couldn't breathe, or paced for hours with Eli when he wouldn't sleep. No one else knows them the way we do. So we tell the truth." Jessa stared at him, stunned. "You want to go public?" "Yes, on our terms." She shook her head. "You're out of your mind. We're not a couple. We're barely civil most days." "Then we tell them that too," he said. "That this wasn't a romance, that it wasn't a fairy tale. It was a decision, a flawed one, but not criminal, not malicious. You gave birth to them. I raised them. We both love them." Her hands tightened around Lena's back. "And what happens when they grow up and read every word? What happens when they think we use them to protect ourselves?" "We show them the truth," he said, his voice low. "We show them that we fought for them. Together." There was a long silence filled only by the hum of city noise below and the baby's soft breaths against her skin. Then she said, "I want legal guardianship. Joint, not temporary, not symbolic." Cassian nodded. "Done. I want my name on their records, birth certificates, medical files, school applications." "Done. I want to be their mother." He met her gaze without hesitation. "You already are." That afternoon, they sat side by side on a couch facing a camera in a quiet studio. The city outside muffled behind soundproof glass. No stylists, no makeup artists, just them. Jessa wore a soft blue sweater and jeans. Cassian wore a dark blazer, no tie. They didn't smile for the camera. They didn't rehearse lines. They spoke. Cassian went first. "I'm Cassian Ward. 6 months ago, my sister died unexpectedly. She had begun the process of having a child through surrogacy. When she passed, the embryos were still viable. The agency contacted me. I chose to continue the process, not because I was ready to be a father, but because I wanted to honor her dream." He looked into the lens as if he could see his children through it. "I made mistakes. I was distant. I thought money would insulate us from fallout. It didn't. But those children, Eli and Lena, are not contracts. They're not headlines. They're lives. And they deserve better than silence." Then it was Jessa's turn. "I'm Jessa Thorne. I was the surrogate. I signed that contract because I needed to. Not because I was tricked. Not because I didn't understand, but because I was desperate to save someone I loved. I didn't know who would receive the children. I didn't ask. I was told not to." She paused, then continued, voice trembling. "But the moment I gave birth to them, I knew something had changed. You don't walk away from something you carried under your heart for 9 months. Not without bleeding a little. I didn't try to steal them. I didn't try to erase what I agreed to. I just wanted to know if they were safe." Her hand brushed Cassian's lightly on the couch. "And now I know, because they're with us. Both of us." The video went viral. Some believed them. Some didn't. The opinions didn't matter. What mattered was the silence that followed. The pulling back of reporters. The deflation of the story. The investigation lost steam. The agency was put under review. A settlement was quietly reached with former employees. And the world, fickle and impatient, turned its attention to fresher scandals. That night, Jessa stood in the nursery, watching the twins sleep. She felt Cassian behind her before she heard him. "You still think we're not a couple?" he asked, his voice almost playful. She turned, a wry smile on her lips. "You still think this is just a decision?" He stepped forward slowly, stopping only when his hand was close enough to reach hers but didn't. "No," he said softly. "It was a beginning." And this time, she reached for him first. Spring came late that year, as if the city had been holding its breath through a winter that refused to end. The first hints of green returned slowly, brushing the edges of Central Park with soft buds and shy blossoms. Rain came in measured intervals, gentle enough to invite walks with strollers, and quiet enough not to scare the twins. In the Ward penthouse, life did not return to normal. It became something entirely different, something deeper. For the first time in many years, Cassian Ward allowed himself to stop running toward legacy and start living in the present. The house changed in small but significant ways. The sleek, minimal aesthetic that had once dominated the apartment gave way to chaos that made sense only to those who lived there. There were toys tucked under chairs, a soft stain on the couch from a dropped bottle, bibs folded on countertops, and tiny socks tucked into drawers where cufflinks used to be. Cassian's office, once sacred and silent, now had a playpen in the corner and a child-proof lock on the bottom drawer. His once immaculate schedule now bent to nap times and diaper changes. And he didn't seem to mind. Jessa had found a rhythm of her own. She was no longer a guest or an observer. She was a mother, and the home responded to her presence like the earth does to light. She sang in the mornings while feeding Lena and Eli, her voice soft but sure. She brought fresh flowers into the kitchen every Friday. She left scribbled reminders on Post-its beside Cassian's laptop. Buy wipes. Call Dr. Kim. Smile more. The staff, once stiff and distant, adored her. Even the night nanny, who had once treated Jessa like a threat, now took her baking tips and left the house humming. Some evenings, Cassian and Jessa would meet on the terrace after the babies were asleep, each holding a glass of wine or a cup of tea. They didn't always talk. Sometimes they just watched the city breathe below them. Two people who had lived entire separate lives and were now slowly building a new one together. And on one of those evenings, as the breeze softened and the last amber light of sunset dipped behind the skyline, Cassian turned to her and said, "I'm selling Aeon." Jessa blinked, unsure if she had heard him right. "You're what?" He didn't look at her, only at the horizon. "I've been negotiating the terms for weeks. I'll keep a stake, but I'm stepping down as CEO. "Why now?" she asked, her voice quiet but steady. "Because I spent the last decade building something I thought would outlive me. I thought that was the only way to matter. But none of it ever looked me in the eyes like Lena does when she wants to be held. None of it ever grabbed my finger the way Eli does before he falls asleep." He finally turned to her, and his voice dropped lower, more intimate. "And none of it ever made me feel like home the way you do." Jessa's throat tightened, and for a long moment she said nothing. Then she asked, "What will you do instead?" He smiled slightly. "I thought I'd start by walking them to preschool. Maybe try my hand at writing again. Spend a few mornings not in a boardroom, but here, with you, with them." The quiet stretch between them, not heavy this time, but light, like a thread being tied rather than cut. Weeks passed, then months. The media story faded into the background. Their guardianship of the twins was solidified, their names legally corrected to reflect both parents. Jessa and Cassian took turns attending baby music classes and pediatric checkups. They argued over sleep routines and formula brands, but not about love. That, finally, was no longer in question. One summer afternoon, Cassian took Jessa and the twins to a private house on the coast. He didn't say much about the trip, just that he wanted to get away from the noise. The house was quiet and sunlit, with wide windows and white curtains that danced with the ocean breeze. Jessa sat on the porch swing, rocking slowly with Lena asleep against her chest. When Cassian walked out barefoot, holding a small box, she saw it in his hand and her heart skipped. He didn't kneel. That wasn't him. Instead, he sat beside her, opened the box between them, and revealed a ring. A simple, elegant band with a single oval-cut diamond set low, designed not to snag on baby clothes or scrape delicate skin. "I never believed in love contracts," he said softly. "And I know we didn't begin like most people. But I believe in you, in us, in what we've built. I don't need forever written in ink. I just need you to stay. Jessa stared at the ring, then at him. I never wanted a fairy tale, she whispered. Just a life I didn't have to survive. He took her hand. Then let's live one we get to choose. She didn't cry. She smiled, slow and radiant, and said, yes. The wedding wasn't grand. It wasn't even called a wedding. They signed papers at City Hall one morning with the twins in matching outfits and coffee cups in their hands. They laughed more than they spoke. Later that evening, they invited friends and a few trusted family members to the coastal house. The twins were carried down the aisle before them by the nanny and Cassian's godson. Jessa wore a white sundress. Cassian wore linen and sandals. Their vows were improvised, whispered under their breath as the breeze scattered flower petals into the sand. I never expected to find you, Jessa murmured. And I never expected to deserve you, he replied. They kissed to the sound of waves and clapping and a baby squealing somewhere in the background. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't polished, but it was real. That night, after the guests had left and the sky had darkened into velvet, Jessa stood at the crib, watching Lena sleep with one fist curled at her cheek and a drool patch spreading across her tiny blanket. Cassian wrapped his arms around her from behind and rested his chin on her shoulder. We made it, she whispered. No, he said gently. We started. And outside, the ocean kept breathing in and out, steady and endless, just like the life they had finally begun to claim as their own.